Hey everyone, welcome back. Today what I want to do is talk about how to get that perfect exposure when shooting video. To do this, we are going to examine 5 different ways that we can control light. That's light, ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and, well, ND filters. Now, okay, balancing 5 different aspects of controlling light, it sounds pretty complicated, but I'm going to make it about as simple as I can, so stick with me, let's do this. Now, the first thing we want to do is talk about light. After all, getting that perfect exposure means controlling for how light enters the camera. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that, well, if you increase light, you're going to get increased exposure, and if you decrease the light, you get less, okay? Now, I know you're going to be tempted to just kind of pass this section by, but bear with me. So I have my key light up here, and I can control it. It's currently at 35% intensity, luma, right? Well, all right, if I bring that way down, well, okay, now we have less exposure. And if I bring it way up, okay, now I have a lot more exposure. Now, you might be saying, duh, no kidding, Lon, but let me show you something. So we are here in the Adobe, Adobe Premiere Pro, and we are trying to run this video now through post, right? We're going to try to do some color correction. And notice, no matter what I do in post, these white sections of my skin, there's no color in there. That means that this part of my skin has been blown out. This means that no matter what I do in post, I can't get any color out of there. And so it's going to look awful. Same thing happens when we are here with too little light. Notice down here where it's black, there is no color in there. No matter what I do in post, nothing is going to come out of that because it's just no exposure, no light. So part of figuring out how to run our exposure properly is figuring out how we are going to let light in. Okay, that's the first part. All right, the next thing we want to look at is ISO. ISO is basically how sensitive the receiving plate in the back of the camera is. I know there's a special term for what that plate is. I don't know what it is. All right? You want a professional, find a professional. Anyway, as light comes in through the lens and is received on the plate, if it's super, super sensitive, is going to pick up more light. And if it's less sensitive, it's going to pick up less light, less exposure. All right, that sounds obvious enough, but what does this mean in practice? Well, let's check this out. Right now, I am shooting at ISO 100. That is as low as I can get my camera in terms of sensitivity to exposure, sensitivity to light when shooting video. Well, is low good? Well, yes, in point of fact, low is really good. You get better quality video there. Now, of course, I could take it up to, say, 800 or 1600, which is making the plate super sensitive to light. But check this out. I just amped the ISO way up. It's like super up. It's like 16,000 or something like that, which means the plate in the back of my camera is super sensitive. So if I were shooting in a really dark environment, I could pick up light. However, you probably noticed that the picture, well, it's a little grainy. It doesn't look quite as sharp as it did when I was shooting at ISO 100. So when I'm shooting video, I'd like to shoot at as low a sensitivity as I can get. We're talking ISO 100, 125. I definitely don't like to go above 200. Not that you would really notice, but at least that's one variable I don't really have to think about in terms of how to set my camera. All right, the next one we need to think about is shutter speed. Now, the good news is you really don't have to think about shutter speed. Here's the rule of thumb. Whatever frame rate you're shooting at, you want to double that, and there's your shutter speed. So for instance, I shoot at 24 frames per second. This is kind of the industry standard when it comes to movies and cinema and so forth. Therefore, we are used to watching movies at 24 frames per second. You double 24 and you get to 48. Well, most cameras just set that at 50. Now, shutter speed means that you are only letting in a certain amount of light. If you reduce the shutter speed, you let in more light. If you increase the shutter speed, you let in less light. But we don't really need to worry about that because, well, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, set it at 50. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, set it at 60. Don't worry about shutter speed. Just let the math take care of you. All right. That brings us to aperture, or f-stop. This is really where things start to get a little bit complicated, but it's not that bad. Aperture is basically how small or how large is the hole that is letting light in through the lens hitting that plate in the back. So if you have a teeny tiny hole, not much light is getting in through the lens and hitting the back of the plate. Whereas if the aperture is wide open, great big hole, well then lots of light is coming in. Okay, that makes sense. Now, here's the thing when it comes to aperture. It's measured in f-stops on your camera. And so right now I am shooting at my f-stop of 1.4. Now that means the aperture is wide open. Here's the way to remember that a smaller number means a more open aperture. The aperture is how many times could that opening be stacked up inside the lens. So 1.4 means, well, it could only go a little larger before it is the size of the lens. Whereas if you set your aperture at, say, 16, that means the aperture opening is so small that you could stack that hole up 16 times and it would still be inside the lens. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of our shots? Well, the way we set our aperture kind of determines our depth of field. Now, depth of field means how much of your subject is in focus versus how much of the background is out of focus. The larger your aperture, the less depth of field you are going to have, which means I am in focus, but everything behind me and everything in front of me is out of focus. All right? So if you want everything in focus because you just love your background, so on and so forth, or whatever, then you want a small aperture. You want a high number in terms of the f-stop, right? You want an f-stop of something like 10 or what have you. Whereas if you want this blurry background, you want a wide open aperture, which means you want a low number. Now, just so you know, not all lenses can go to really low apertures or, low aperture number, wide open. My lens goes to 1.4, and that's what we would call a fast lens, and they're more expensive. A lot of lenses will only go to, say, an f-stop of 4 or higher. So let me show you what this means in terms of depth of field. So take a look at this background now. It's much more crisp, which means my depth of field is much deeper, much larger, okay? I don't know the technical term, you just have a greater depth of field. Now, the way I did this is I reduced the size of my aperture. My aperture went from 1.4 to something like 8, which means, yeah, it's small enough that that hole could be stacked up 8 times inside the lens. Now, because this let in a lot less light, I had to increase my ISO. My ISO is now at 800. This allowed me to get a greater depth of field. So if this is the look you're going for, that's what you want to play with. Okay, that brings us to the fifth and final consideration when trying to control your exposure. And that is the use of an ND filter. Now, I don't know what ND stands for, probably something fancy. I don't know, right? But an ND filter is basically sunglasses for your lens, all right? It's a filter that you screw on to the front of your lens, and it's sunglasses. Now, what you can do is you can use a variable ND filter. And a variable ND filter allows you to turn it up or down. So for example, I have a variable ND filter on this camera right now, and I can reach on over and check it out. I just turned the sunglasses so up that you can hardly see a thing. And then I can bring it back down. Now, why would you want to use an ND filter, especially when you're shooting indoors, right? I mean, it's not like we have sunlight coming in. Well, here's the thing. The ND filter allows me to open my aperture way up. Now remember, the aperture lets light in. So since I have it cranked all the way open, it allows a lot of light to come in. So if I take this ND filter off, so you see, now a lot more light is getting into that plate. And so, yeah, I'm overexposed. And furthermore, my ISO is already at 100, which is the least sensitive setting I have available to me on my camera. So what are my options? Well, I can reduce the size of my aperture, right? Take it from an f-stop of 1.4 to, I don't know, 2 point something or another. And that helps, but now notice my depth of field is not as narrow as it was. And I like having that narrow depth of field. And so everything in the background is more clear than it was before. So it really just depends on what look you're going for. Well, I like that blurry background, or at least to some extent anyway, so I want to have my aperture as open as I can get it. So this ND filter helps solve the problem. I open that aperture back up, it's as wide as it goes, and I pop this bad boy on. Now I have that narrow depth of field, and yet my exposure is exactly where I want it. So there you are. Control your light, your ISO, your shutter speed, your aperture, and consider using an ND filter, and you will get that perfect exposure. Do some test shots, play around with them, get that look that you're really going for, and you'll be in great shape. All right, thanks a lot for joining me. We'll talk again soon.